The second part of Cohen's essay, as I read it, focuses on rights versus obligations. The main idea in this part of the essay is that rights entail obligations. However, obligations do not necessarily entail rights. The significance of this point will ultimately be that Cohen is willing to admit that humans have moral obligations to animals. But those moral obligations do not entail or do not show that animals possess rights, okay? Rights entail obligations, but obligations do not entail rights. So let's begin with this first claim, that rights do entail obligations. So for instance, if I possess a right to freedom of speech, my right entails a moral obligation on your part. You have a moral obligation to respect my right. Where does that moral obligation come from? It is based in my having a right. So sometimes moral obligations stem from rights. And whenever there's a right, whenever someone possesses a right, that will necessarily entail moral obligations on the part of others, okay? However, moral obligations do not necessarily entail rights. That is to say, just because one being has moral obligations to another being, that does not mean that that other being possesses rights, because there could be other sources of those moral obligations besides rights, okay? Rights are one source of moral obligations, but they are not the only source of moral obligations. That is why moral obligations do not necessarily entail rights. So for instance, one example that Cohen gives is that moral obligations can stem from or can arise from commitments that are freely made, right? For instance, as a student in my class, you do not, according to Cohen, have a right to demand that I put comments on your essays. You do not have any such right. However, as the professor, I may have a moral obligation to put comments on your essays, and the source of my moral obligation is my freely made commitment. I freely committed to being your professor, and one of the responsibilities of being a professor is providing meaningful feedback to your students. So I have a moral obligation to provide comments on your essay, but that does not show, that does not mean that you have a right to demand those comments, okay? Because again, there can be other sources of moral obligations besides rights. Another source of moral obligations are special relationships. The one example Cohen gives is the relationship between a host and a guest. Let's say I invite you over for dinner tomorrow night. And you come over and we're hanging out and you're sitting on the couch and it's getting kind of late and you're like thinking to yourself, I'm hungry. We would probably agree that you do not have a right to demand dinner or to demand to be fed, right? However, I may have a moral obligation to feed you, to provide you with dinner. Why? Because of my special relationship. As the host, I have a responsibility, a moral obligation to provide you with dinner or drinks or something of that nature. But just because I have a moral obligation, that does not mean that you have a right to demand that of me, okay? So again, there can be sources of moral obligations. Moral obligations can arise from sources other than rights. When there is a right, that does entail obligations on the part of others. But if others have obligations, that does not automatically entail rights on the part of others, okay? Now, what's the real significance of this distinction? Cohen is willing to admit that humans have moral obligations to animals. More specifically, Cohen says animals are not stones. They feel. In other words, animals are sentient, right? So Cohen is agreeing with Matheny's point here, and he's saying, based on animals' sentience, humans have a moral obligation not to cause unnecessary pain and suffering to animals. The source of that moral obligation on the part of humans is the sentience in the animals. But moral obligations do not entail rights. Just because humans have a moral obligation to animals not to cause them unnecessary pain and suffering, that does not entail that animals possess rights. Okay? So maybe Cohen is trying to be, take a middle ground here. He's trying to be compromising in a sense. And he's trying to say, look, I'm willing to admit that humans have moral obligations to animals, that we shouldn't just be causing random wanton pain and suffering on animals for no justified reason. But at the same time, I, Carl Cohen, am not willing to admit that animals possess rights. And he will move on to the reasoning as to why animals do not possess rights, and in fact, why they cannot possess rights in part 3, where he will make a distinction between moral agents and moral patients. So let's now turn our attention to that.